The planners in Tokyo had studied the American fleet for years. They knew every ship, every gun, every weakness. They built their entire strategy around one simple fact: sink the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, and the United States Navy would be crippled for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Long enough for Japan to fortify the Pacific so completely that America would have no choice but to negotiate peace. They executed their plan flawlessly. They caught the Americans asleep. They sank battleships. They destroyed aircraft. And for exactly 6 months, it looked like they were right. But what happened next, the moment they discovered what they were actually facing, shattered every assumption they had made about American naval power and revealed a truth so terrifying it would haunt Japanese admirals for the rest of their lives. In December 1941, Japan's assessment of American naval capability wasn't arrogance. It was math. Cold, careful, professional math. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the third largest in the world, and by many measures, the most advanced. Their officers were products of a warrior tradition stretching back centuries. Their ships were masterpieces of engineering. The Yamato, their flagship battleship, was the largest and most powerful warship ever built, mounting guns so massive they could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles. Their naval aviators were the best trained in the world, with thousands of hours of combat experience from China. Their torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, were faster, longer ranged, and more deadly than anything America possessed. And their night fighting doctrine was so superior that American ships literally couldn't see them coming. So when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, stood before the Emperor and his war cabinet, he told them the truth as he understood it. If ordered to fight America, he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had no confidence in victory. Not because Japanese fighting spirit was inferior, but because America's industrial capacity, if fully mobilized, would eventually overwhelm them. The other admirals nodded politely at Yamamoto's caution, but privately, most thought he was being too pessimistic. They had done the math. America had 8 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 10. America's battleship fleet was older, slower. Japan's naval construction program would launch 2 super battleships and 3 new carriers in the next 18 months. By contrast, American shipyards were building cargo ships and destroyers. Nothing that would fundamentally change the balance of power. Not for years. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm everything. On the morning of December 7th, Japanese carrier aircraft achieved complete surprise. They sank or damaged 8 battleships. They destroyed nearly 200 aircraft on the ground. American casualties were catastrophic. Over 2,000 men dead. The images of burning ships and black smoke rising over Hawaii were broadcast worldwide. In Tokyo, there was jubilation. The American Pacific Fleet, the only force that could possibly threaten Japan's expansion, had been crippled in a single morning. The path to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, to the rubber plantations of Malaya, to the rice paddies of Burma, all of it was now wide open. But there was one problem. A problem that didn't seem significant at the time. The American carriers weren't there. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea, delivering aircraft to outlying bases. They survived. Still, 3 carriers against 10. The Japanese weren't worried. The next 6 months were a Japanese fever dream of conquest. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the great British fortress in Asia, surrendered after a campaign so brilliant it's still studied in military academies. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino forces under General MacArthur, collapsed. The Dutch East Indies were overrun. Burma was taken. In less than half a year, Japan carved out an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. Their forces had advanced thousands of miles. They controlled resources, populations, and strategic positions that made them, on paper, nearly invincible. American attempts to strike back were feeble, almost pathetic. The Doolittle raid in April, 16 B-25 bombers, launched from a carrier to bomb Tokyo, did negligible physical damage. It was a propaganda stunt. The Japanese High Command barely flinched. But that raid did something the Japanese didn't anticipate. It terrified them, not because of the damage, but because it proved American carriers could reach the home islands. The Imperial Navy decided they needed to eliminate those carriers permanently. The target was Midway Island, a tiny atoll halfway across the Pacific. The plan was to invade Midway and lure the remaining American carriers into a trap where Japan's superior numbers and veteran pilots would destroy them once and for all. It was a sound plan, a professional plan, and in early June 1942, the most powerful naval armada Japan had ever assembled set sail. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, an invasion force. They expected to face, at most, 2 American carriers. They were ready to face 3. What they were not ready for was what actually happened. The Battle of Midway is often taught as a story of American luck and Japanese mistakes. And yes, there was luck. There were mistakes. But what's often missed is the moment, the specific, gut-wrenching moment, when Japanese commanders realized they weren't fighting the enemy they thought they understood. It came on the morning of June 4th. Japanese scouts had finally spotted the American fleet. The report came in. Enemy carriers sighted. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had a decision to make. His aircraft were armed with bombs for a second strike on Midway Island. To attack the American ships, he needed to bring them below deck, swap the bombs for torpedoes, and relaunch. It would take time, precious time, but he gave the order. Then, the American attacks began. Wave after wave of American torpedo bombers came in low and slow. They were obsolete Douglas Devastators, flying straight and level, easy targets. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Japanese sailors cheered. American airmen were brave, they'd give them that. But they were also poorly trained and flying inferior aircraft. This was going to be easier than expected. And then, in a span of 5 minutes, everything changed. While Japanese fighters were down at wave level slaughtering the torpedo bombers, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, unnoticed, unopposed. They rolled into their dives. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked in the open. Fuel lines were snaking across the deck. The American bombs, 1,000-pounders, came screaming down. They punched through the flight decks and detonated in the hangars below. The result wasn't just damage, it was annihilation. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was turned into an inferno within minutes. Kaga exploded so violently that men were blown off the deck into the sea. Soryu was gutted. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, were burning wrecks. By the end of the day, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, would be sunk as well. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, and with them, the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Forever. The Japanese High Command tried to process what had happened. They told themselves it was bad luck, poor reconnaissance, a fluke. But in the quiet offices of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, some officers were beginning to ask a darker question. How did the Americans know? How did they know exactly where the Japanese fleet would be? How did they have their carriers positioned perfectly for an ambush? The answer, which they wouldn't fully understand until after the war, was that American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes. The Americans had read their plans. They knew the target. They knew the timing. They knew the composition of the fleet. Midway wasn't a fair fight. It was an execution. And that should have been the moment Japan realized they were facing something different. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because Japan still had ships. They still had pilots. They still had fighting spirit. The Americans had won a battle, yes, but they were still on the defensive, still reacting. Japan controlled the vast majority of the Pacific. They convinced themselves they could rebuild, regroup, and hold what they had taken. Then the Americans did something that made no sense. Something that violated every principle of military strategy the Japanese understood. Just 2 months after Midway, in August 1942, American Marines landed on an insignificant speck of jungle called Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was a backwater. There was nothing there but a half-built Japanese airfield and malaria-infested swamps. The Japanese assumed it was a raid, a small operation. They sent a few thousand troops to push the Marines back into the sea. Those troops were slaughtered, so they sent more and more. For 6 months, Japan poured men and ships into a meat grinder over an island that, strategically, shouldn't have mattered. But the Americans wouldn't leave. Every time the Japanese attacked, the Marines held. Every time the Japanese Navy tried to reinforce, American ships and aircraft intercepted them. The waters around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound because of the dozens of ships, American and Japanese, that sank there. Japan lost 2 more fleet carriers. Shikaku and Zuikaku were damaged so badly they were out of action for months. They lost battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and worst of all, they lost pilots. Veteran pilots. Pilots who couldn't be replaced. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. They spun it as a strategic withdrawal. But every officer with a map knew the truth. They had been beaten. And here's where the real horror began to sink in. Japanese intelligence officers started receiving reports from the front that didn't make sense. Reports that American pilots, shot down and captured, had less than a year of training. Some had less than 6 months. These weren't the grizzled veterans Japan had fought at Midway. These were kids, barely trained kids. And yet there were hundreds of them, thousands of them. Japanese aces, men with dozens of kills, men who had been flying since China, looked at the numbers and felt something they'd never felt before. Dread. Because if America was sending barely trained pilots and still matching Japan in the air, what would happen when those pilots got experienced? What would happen when the next wave arrived? and the wave after that. Then came the reports from the shipyards. Japanese naval intelligence had spies and contacts in neutral countries. They subscribed to American newspapers and trade journals. They tracked ship launches. And in late 1942, they started seeing numbers that their analysts initially rejected as American propaganda. The reports claimed that American shipyards had launched a new fleet carrier, then another, then two more. The analysts checked and rechecked. They looked at construction times. They looked at industrial capacity. By every standard they understood, building a fleet carrier took 3 to 4 years. America was building them in 18 months. And they weren't building one or two. They were building dozens. Essex-class carriers, Independence-class light carriers, Casablanca-class escort carriers, an entire new generation of flat tops, each one larger, faster, and more capable than the carriers Japan had lost. By mid-1943, the math had become a nightmare. Japan started the war with 10 fleet carriers. They had lost 6. They had 4 left, and their construction program would add maybe 2 more by 1944. The United States started with 7 carriers in the Pacific. By the end of 1943, they had over 30, and more were coming, every single month. The Japanese admirals sat in their war rooms and stared at the projections. It was impossible. It defied logic. But the evidence was irrefutable. America wasn't rebuilding their navy. They were building an entirely new one, from scratch. And it was bigger than the Japanese and American navies combined had been at the start of the war. But carriers were just the beginning. The Americans were also building destroyers. Lots of destroyers. Japan's destroyers were beautiful ships, fast and deadly, but they took time to build and skilled labor to maintain. America was welding together Fletcher-class destroyers on assembly lines like they were cars. They were launching 2, sometimes 3 a week, every week. Japan's submarine force, which should have been strangling American supply lines, was instead being systematically hunted and destroyed by American destroyer escorts, small, cheap, mass-produced sub-hunters that Japan couldn't sink faster than America built them. And then there were the submarines. American submarines, which had started the war with faulty torpedoes and timid tactics, had fixed their weapons and changed their doctrine. By 1943, they were operating with near impunity, sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. Japan was an island nation. Everything, fuel, food, raw materials, had to come by ship. At the start of the war, Japan had 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1944, half of it was on the bottom of the Pacific. The oil from the Dutch East Indies, the entire reason Japan went to war, couldn't reach the home islands. Tankers were being torpedoed within sight of port. The Navy was rationing fuel. Pilots were getting less training because there wasn't enough aviation gas. The war machine was starving. And every time Japan tried to organize a convoy, tried to reinforce a garrison, tried to move troops, American submarines were there, waiting, hunting. The Japanese Navy had been designed to fight a climactic, decisive battle. A modern Tsushima where superior Japanese skill and spirit would triumph. But the Americans refused to fight that battle. Instead, they were waging a war of industrial attrition. And Japan was losing. In November 1943, the Americans attacked Tarawa, a tiny fortified atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese garrison fought to the last man. Out of nearly 5,000 defenders, only 17 were captured alive. The Americans took horrific casualties, over 1,000 Marines dead in 3 days. Japanese propagandists called it a victory. But the Japanese commanders who studied the battle saw something else. They saw that the Americans had learned. They had brought overwhelming fire support. Battleships, cruisers, carriers. They had pounded the island with more explosives than had been dropped on some entire cities. And when the Marines landed, they kept coming, wave after wave. The Americans didn't care about casualties the way Japan did. They had replacements. They had medical ships waiting offshore. Wounded Marines were evacuated, treated, and many returned to fight again. Japanese wounded died in bunkers. And then the Americans did it again. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, was bypassed and bombed into irrelevance. The American advance wasn't cautious. It wasn't methodical. It was relentless. They would hit an island, take it in days, build an airfield in weeks, and move on. Japanese garrisons, cut off and unsupplied, were left to starve. The strategy was called island hopping, but to the Japanese, it felt like watching a tsunami approach. Unstoppable, inevitable, drowning everything in its path.